I just want to thank Ed Choice, the Palmetto Promise Institute, and the Diocese of Charleston for having me here today. I just have a few remarks and then, a couple of questions I want to pose to all of you. I work in a lot of different states. I help people in a lot of different states. I know every state is different, so I just want to throw some ideas out there, and then you can figure out what the best thing for you is based on that when you think about expanding school choice here in the Palmetto State. I want to tell you a story about a little red house in southwest Baltimore. It was my grandmother's house, and it was once filled with love. Now, that house is vacant. It is boarded up in a neighborhood that feels as sick as it does dangerous. This little red house is one you do not know. It is unimportant to you, but it remains deeply important to me, both for what happened there and for where it is. This little red house is the one I grew up in. I spent most of my young years there. I threw a lacrosse ball at its side across the narrow alley next to it. The thud of the ball made the brick of the whole building vibrate. I slept there. I did my homework there in a blue chair in the living room. When I graduated from high school, my whole family came to see me off to college in faraway New Hampshire that fall. None of this will matter to you. But there is another thing about that house that may matter, and that is its location. Equidistant between a corner where a young black boy named Freddie Gray had his last altercation with the police, one that left him dead and with his neck broken, and another corner, this one at North and Pennsylvania Avenues, where the Baltimore uprising was christened in flame on national television. The unrest in Baltimore might be the reason you know that corner, but I knew it because I spent what seemed like half of my life there, waiting for buses or subways to take me to schools far away from Penn North and the neighborhood of Sandtown, Winchester, where I am from. Those rides got longer and longer over the years, until I was once I was old enough that the school bus didn't pick me up anymore to take me to Harford Heights over on the east side, or Roland Park, the city's richest middle school out in its magnificent planned community designed by Frederick Olmsted himself. Eventually, the only way a bus could get me to my last school, the St. Paul School for Boys in Brooklynville, Maryland, was to pair it with a subway, another bus, and a long walk up Falls Road from what we called the Windy Valley. The blessings of my life kept making that circle bigger, and I kept going further and further away to get them. And those blessings and the education that came with them made it possible for me to be here with you today, for all of us to be here, alive and in this special moment. All of this is to say my life has been profoundly shaped by school choice. My aunt, who worked in the Baltimore City public school system, gamed it as much as she could on my behalf. And I remain profoundly grateful for the scholarship I received to attend St. Paul's, which I never would have gone to if my mom had to pay full freight for it, I had to live close to it, or I had to win the parent lottery to get into it. So when I talk to you about school choice, I just want you to know, for me, it's not just about policy, it's personal. So I don't need to tell anyone in this room that there's an important discussion happening all across the country. I know it's happening here in the halls of this Capitol about school choice and the many forms it can take. I like to call those the tools of school choice: tax credits, opportunity scholarships, charter schools, interdistrict public school choice, magnet schools, and education scholarship accounts, which I know are in front of you now. That's all important. And I'm sure that we'll have a chance to discuss the tools a bit later. But I actually think lawmakers, like yourselves, pursue policy change based on belief. They encounter some condition in the world that they find unjust, or that could be better or improved, one that could advance the causes of fairness or freedom, and they are empowered to act to change that condition. Sometimes the stars align, and they actually do. So the facts matter, but belief does as well. And with that in mind, I just want to offer a few questions for you to think on as you're trying to figure out how, if, and for whom you may want to expand school choice here in South Carolina. So the first thing, and I'll just get right to it. Ask yourself this question: do you think private schools have a role to play in helping us build a more dynamic, parent and student-centered system of education, or don't they? The question of what policy tool you use to answer this the question what policy tool you use to answer this question is almost incidental, and it's potentially irrelevant depending on how you actually answer this question of belief. So again, can private schools help us fix some of the challenges that are faced by our education systems overall? And most importantly, the students within them. And if so, under which conditions should they? I personally think yes. And I think my reasons to you should all be pretty clear now. But I also want to offer what I think we all know, that there is no one way to educate a child. And I just want like a little interactive exercise here. Who has more than one child, or like a relative with more than one child? Raise your hand. Okay, so I know sometimes you look at one of them and you're like, this one is mine. And you look at the other one and you're like, where did you come from? So if we know that two children who live in the same house, breathe the same air, grow up with the same family can be so different, it follows that no one system could educate all children as well. I happen to believe we need all the help we can get. We often use private schools to help us address the challenges that children with special needs face. So why not use that tool to help us address the problems of other children too? Again, like I respect state context a great deal. I'm not trying to answer these questions for you, but I do think you should come up with an answer for them as you're, amongst yourselves as you move on. And I know currently that's something that you're trying to do. So the second thing, lots of people, I think rightly, worry about creating a system where some people choose and some people are essentially pushed out of choosing. And some schools cream the best kids while leaving everyone else to fend for themselves. I want you to consider that this isn't a system you want to prevent. It is instead one you might want to attack because it's the one you already have. To rephrase, you already have a choice system. It just doesn't embody the values of equal opportunity for all kids and families very well at all. I think this hides in plain sight. In plain sight most of the time, but I do want to highlight it here. There are 4 ways that most people access school choice. You're rich. You buy the right house, you move to the right place, you get the school you want. You're lucky, like me. You win the lottery, you get a scholarship someplace, you go to the right school, your life has changed forever. You're connected or elected, right? You know the right person, or you already have enough power to sort of manipulate the system in a way that works for your advantage. And the last one is that you lie. So I know nobody here has done this before, because this is a room full of amazing law-abiding people. But if you know someone who has lied about their address to get into the school that they want to get into but are not zoned to, raise your hand. And you will not be seen raising your hand on camera. I only highlight this to say that, what's going on here? Whenever you have an environment where something that people want is made scarce on purpose, you develop a black market for it. And in this case, you criminalize, ultimately, the pursuit of a great education if you can't hit any of the other 3 things that I mentioned earlier. When you're a kid, there are conversations that people have around you that don't make sense until much later in your life. And so recently I've been reflecting on a conversation I overheard my mother and my grandmother have when I was a child about whose address we were going to use to get me into the middle school in Bolton Hill that I was not zoned for versus the one, Harlem Park, that I was. Didn't make sense to me until 30 years later exactly what was going on there. Now I want to put a slightly finer point on this as well. Lots of people are worried about discrimination in choice, and they should be. The discrimination conversation is a complicated one, but it's also a nuanced one. I went to an all-boys high school. Does anyone know what an all-boys high school does? It discriminates against women, right? But what I think is actually lost is that many of our traditional public school systems actually discriminate in 2 pretty pernicious ways. And I'm a supporter of great public schools. The first one I alluded to earlier is that they discriminate by wealth, which hurts young families and communities that suffer the long-term effects of redlining a great deal. It also allows the wealthy and the privileged to basically hoard their advantage by clustering together with each other. And if you're interested in exploring this, you can read this book by Richard Reeves called Dream Hoarders, which Brookings published about a year and a half ago, and which asserts that the American upper middle and upper classes engage in what he calls opportunity hoarding that makes it both more difficult to try innovative approaches to policy and harder for others to rise up the economic ladder and actualize the promise of the American dream. He very specifically cites school zoning as an example. To be clear, I'm not saying anyone should be penalized for hard work, risk-taking, or being successful and trying to build the best life for their family or for their children. But I am saying that public policy can affect the environment and affect the environment, and that matters a great deal where education is concerned. Now, I know South Carolina has some choice, but I also know it's relatively scarce. And I think we all know what happens when something is scarce, like we talked about earlier, like black markets are created, and I don't think that that's what anybody really wants. The other way our public schools discriminate, though, is actually by ability. Test and magnets, gifted and talented programs, which in full disclosure, I attended as a kid. Quasi-school choice programs where principals can make the final decisions. Like in New York, we have these things called beacon schools, where basically like test scores are a factor, but an interview with the principal and a whole bunch of opaque subjective criteria are also used in figuring out who gets to go where. All of these things have created a system within a system, where essentially, if you have strong academic skills, or in the case of the beacon schools, you have really enriched home lives, you get the school that you want, and everybody else scrambles for opportunity. If a tax credit program, or an education scholarship account, or a charter school had test-based selective admissions, where the school leader had the final say, the world would end. But somehow we've allowed these conditions to flourish in many of our traditional district systems. Like, why is that? So when you consider what might happen if you offer more opportunity to families, I want you to remember what has already happened, and that instead of making more division, you might instead just be making sure everyone involved has the same tools. Now, the last question, I'm at the end. The last question I want you to ask yourselves is just this: who should choose? The one sort of alpha and omega for choice policy, this one is the alpha and omega of choice policy because it gets at the root of everything. Right now, there are lots of people with wealth, influence, or both, and they get to choose whenever and however they want. They get to do this without regard for whether they are good parents or bad ones, whether they have lofty goals for their kids or don't care very much about them at all. And I think we all know being wealthy doesn't guarantee that you're going to make great decisions for your children. And then there's everyone else. They don't get to choose because we choose for them. Like former Secretary of Education Rod Page said once, the state has the power of compulsory attendance, you will go to school, and mandatory assignment, you will go to this school. That's an enormous power, especially when it means you could go to a school that, to be generous, isn't bad, but definitely isn't the right fit for you. Is a world where more parents have the power to intervene when this happens a good one or a bad one? Can empowering people with a wider range of school options improve our return on investment in K-12 overall? Can it help ballast our economy with better educated South Carolinians who matriculate to the workforce? Only you can decide what you think about this crucial and fundamental issue. In closing, I just want to thank EdChoice, the Palmetto Promise Institute, and the Diocese of Charleston for inviting me here today. I want to thank all of you for taking up the difficult questions of how we improve educational opportunity in America and how we improve education systems overall for all of our children. It's been a privilege to speak to you about school choice policy today. It has changed my life, and I know it can help change the lives of many children in South Carolina as well. Thank you.